Zora stared at the shimmering gold chain pooling in the small girl's palm, then up at the man standing over her. Her brain was doing that thing it does when it receives information it doesn't quite have a category for yet. Because this man, this sharp-featured, quietly terrifying Korean man who looked like he owned the very air he breathed, was standing outside a rain-slicked mansion watching his daughter hand over a fortune to a delivery girl. Behind them, the stone-faced guards at the gates of Mansion Manor went very still. And finally, the fear Zora had always felt for men of power turned into a trembling, confused hope. If this story already has you hooked, then smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell, because we bring you powerful stories like this. And besties, don't forget to check the link in the description to join our waitlist for the full details. Tell us where you're watching from. Now, let's take you back to Zora's life before this moment, and a struggle that led her to those gates. Besties, let's get back to the story. The Safe Wacko distribution center sat in a part of the city where the streetlights flickered more than they shone. It was a warehouse of high quotas, minimum wages, and a clock that never seemed to move fast enough. It did everything it was legally required to do for its workers and stopped precisely there, like a machine that performs a task without a soul and expects to be praised for not breaking down. Zora had no memory of a life without the hustle, just the shape that constant survival makes in a person. And the thing about the gig economy was that it should have softened that shape, because there were thousands of others like her, all driving, all delivering, all carrying the same particular weight of being replaceable. You would think that kind of shared struggle would make the world gentle. You would think it would build an understanding. We're all tired here, so let us be kind. It didn't work that way. Not for Zora, because Zora was invisible, and being invisible in a city of giants was its own separate sentence. Others had safety nets or Plan BS. Zora only had the next delivery, and the small mercies that disappear when you realize you're one spilled order away from losing everything. Zora Vance knew the exact weight of a bad day. It felt like the heavy, humid air of a Tuesday afternoon that stuck to her blue and white striped Safe Wacko uniform. It felt like the vibration of her phone, which had been buzzing in her pocket for 3 hours with high-priority alerts from the delivery app. In the world of Safe Wacko, you weren't a person with a name. You were a glowing dot on a map. If the dot stopped moving, the money stopped coming. Zora, you're behind. The voice of her manager, Bill, had barked over the radio earlier that morning. The algorithm doesn't like pauses. If you want to keep this route, you need to move. But moving was hard when your car's engine made a sound like a cough every time you hit the gas. Zora had spent her lunch break counting quarters in her cup holder. She needed $200 for the electric bill and another $50 just to keep her phone turned on. Without the phone, there was no app. Without the app, there was no life. The pressure had been building since 6 a.m. First, a customer had screamed at her because their coffee was lukewarm. Then, a heavy rainstorm had turned the city streets into slick, gray ribbons of danger. By the time she picked up the large, expensive-smelling order from Mansion Manor, Zora was shaking. Her hands were cramped from gripping the steering wheel, and her eyes were red from the lack of sleep. "This is the big one, Zora," she whispered to herself, trying to find a spark of hope. A big house means a big tip. Just one more delivery. She pulled up to the massive iron gates of the manor. The house sat at the end of the road like a king on a throne, cold and untouchable. But as she stepped out of her car, her foot slipped on a patch of wet oil. The world seemed to move in slow motion. The cardboard Safe Wacko box tucked under her arm jerked upward. She reached for it, her fingers brushing the damp edges, but it was too late. The box hit the pavement with a sickening, wet thud. The expensive glass containers inside shattered. Dark sauce and gold-colored noodles began to ooze out of the corners of the box, mixing with the rainwater on the ground. Zora froze. That box wasn't just food, it was her rating. It was the strike 3 that Bill had warned her about. It was the $200 she didn't have. She dropped to her knees in the rain, her hands shaking as she tried to scoop the ruined meal back into the box. But the more she touched it, the more the cardboard fell apart. The Safe Wacko logo on her sleeve felt like a heavy chain. She realized right then that she couldn't fix this. She couldn't fix any of it. The tears came before she could stop them. They were hot and fast, blurring her vision of the fancy mansion. She put her hand over her mouth to stop herself from screaming at the sky. She felt small. She felt invisible. She felt like a nobody crying at the gates of a world that didn't even know she existed. Then, the heavy gates began to creak open. Ji-hoon Kong stood behind the thick glass of his study window, watching the rain wash over the stone driveway of Mansion Manor. To the rest of the city, he was a ghost or a monster. He was the man who moved the pieces of a dark game, ensuring the Kong name stayed powerful. His life was built on silence, expensive suits, and the hard lines of a man who never let his guard down. But as he looked out at the iron gates, his eyes softened for only one person, his daughter, Mina. Mina was sitting on the rug near him, her side braid resting against her dark velvet dress. She was playing quietly, but her eyes were always wandering toward the window. She saw things the way children did, simple and honest. When the security cameras on his desk flickered, Ji-hoon saw a small, blue and white car pull up. A young woman stepped out. She looked tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. He watched her slip. He watched the box hit the ground. From his high window, the spilled food looked like a dark stain on his perfect driveway, but to the woman on her knees, it looked like the end of the world. "Appa," Mina whispered, standing up and tugging on his wool overcoat. "She is hurting." Ji-hoon didn't move at first. In his world, you didn't help people unless they owed you something. Mercy was a debt that most people couldn't pay back. He looked at the woman, Zora, whose name tag was just a blur on the screen. She was sobbing into her hands, her shoulders shaking under the thin fabric of her Safewacko uniform. She looked like a bird with a broken wing, trapped outside a cage of gold. "It is just a meal, Mina," Ji-hoon said, his voice deep and calm. "Someone will clean it up." But Mina didn't listen. She reached into her small jewelry box and pulled out a heavy gold chain. It was an heirloom, a piece of history from their family in Korea. It was worth more than 1,000 deliveries. Before Ji-hoon could stop her, she was heading for the front door. Ji-hoon followed her, his long strides keeping pace with her small steps. As the heavy gates creaked open, the cold rain hit his face. He saw Zora look up, her eyes red and filled with a fear he was very used to seeing. She expected him to yell. She expected him to demand a refund or call her boss. He placed a hand on Mina's back, ready to pull her away. But then he saw Mina's face. She wasn't afraid of the nobody in the dirt. She was looking at Zora with a look of pure understanding. Mina reached out and placed the gold in Zora's shaking hand. Ji-hoon felt a strange pull in his chest. He had spent his whole life taking things from people. He had built an empire on what others lost. But seeing his daughter give something away so freely made him pause. He looked at Zora, really looked at her. She wasn't just a delivery girl. She was a person who had reached her breaking point at his doorstep. He didn't take the gold back. He didn't tell Mina she was being foolish. Instead, he watched Zora's face change from terror to total shock. For the first time in a long time, the architect decided to let a mistake happen. He wanted to see what this woman would do with a miracle. The gold necklace sat on Zora's kitchen table like a fallen star. It was too bright for her cramped apartment, where the wallpaper was peeling and the radiator hissed like a tired snake. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the little girl's calm face and the tall man's shadow. She was terrified to touch the jewelry and even more terrified to sell it. In her world, things this beautiful usually came with a price she couldn't afford to pay. The next morning, a heavy knock echoed through her front door. It wasn't the soft tap of a neighbor. It was a loud, rhythmic thud that made the plates in her cabinet rattle. Zora's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked through the peephole and saw two men in dark, sharp suits standing in the hallway. They looked like they belonged in a movie or a nightmare. "Zora Vance," one of the men called out. His voice was like grinding stones. "Mr. Khan would like a word." Zora opened the door, just a crack, her hands shaking so hard she had to hide them behind her back. I was going to bring it back," she whispered, her voice cracking. "The necklace. I didn't steal it. The little girl, she just gave it to me. Please don't call the police. I already lost my job at Safewacko." The taller man didn't smile. He stepped back and gestured toward the stairs. Mr. Kong does not care about the police, Ms. Vance. He wants to settle the debt properly. There's a car waiting downstairs. Zora felt like she was walking toward her own funeral. She grabbed the gold chain, stuffed it into her pocket, and followed them. The black car waiting at the curb was sleek and silent. The windows were so dark she couldn't see inside. As they drove back toward Mansion Manor, Zora watched the city blur past. She felt small, like a bug caught in a very expensive web. When she arrived, she wasn't taken to the front door. The men led her through a side entrance into a room filled with books and the scent of expensive wood. Ji-hoon Kong was sitting behind a desk, his dark hair perfectly swept back. He looked even more intimidating without the rain blurring his features. Mina was sitting on a chair nearby, swinging her legs and holding a doll. "Sit," Ji-hoon said. It wasn't a request. Zora sat on the edge of a velvet chair, pulling the necklace from her pocket. "Please take it. I can't keep this. It's too much." Ji-hoon looked at the gold, then at Zora. "My daughter does not give gifts lightly," he said slowly, "and I do not like leaving things unfinished. You lost your job because of us. You have no money, and you have no plan." Zora looked at her lap, a fresh tear stinging her eye. "I'll find something else. I always do." "No," Ji-hoon interrupted. "Mina needs someone who is not a guard or a servant who is afraid of me. She needs someone who knows what it's like to care about something small. I'm offering you a position here. You will be her companion. The pay will be 10 times what your delivery app gave you." Zora gasped. It was a miracle wrapped in a warning. She looked at Mina, who was smiling at her, and then at Ji-hoon's cold, watchful eyes. She knew this man was dangerous, but she also knew her fridge was empty. "I accept," she whispered. Zora's first week inside Mansion Manor felt like living inside a beautiful, silent clock. Everything was polished to a shine, from the marble floors that felt like ice under her shoes to the long hallways lined with paintings of people who never smiled. At Safewacko, Zora had been a ghost in the city, rushing through traffic to deliver food to strangers. Here, she was a ghost in a palace. She walked softly, afraid that the sound of her own breathing might disturb the heavy silence of the Kong family. Her job was simple: stay with Mina. But as the days passed, Zora realized that staying with Mina meant being the only person who actually talked to the little girl. The other people in the house, the old-world guards and the silent maids, moved like shadows. They stood by the doors with their hands folded, their eyes fixed on the walls. When Zora tried to say good morning to a guard named Park, he didn't even blink. He looked through her as if she were made of glass. To them, Zora was just a mistake that had been allowed inside. "They don't talk," Mina whispered one afternoon. They were sitting in a massive playroom filled with toys that looked like they had never been touched. Mina was brushing the hair of a porcelain doll, her side braid falling over her shoulder. They only listened for trouble. Zora sat on the plush rug next to her, feeling the ache in her heart grow. She looked at the piles of expensive stuffed animals and the gold-leafed books. "Don't you have friends who come over to play, Mina? Cousins? Classmates?" Mina shook her head slowly. "Appa says the outside is not safe for me, and the people inside are only here to work. Before you came, I just watched the rain from the window." Zora looked around the room and saw the loneliness for what it really was. It was a golden cage. Mina had everything a child could dream of, but she had no one to laugh with. She was a princess in a fortress, surrounded by men with guns and hearts. Made of stone, Ji-hoon was always busy in his study, managing his empire, and the guards were too busy being statues to be human. "Well," Zora said, reaching out to give Mina's hand a gentle squeeze, "I'm not a statue, and I'm not a shadow. If you want to play tag or draw pictures that aren't perfect, I'm right here." A small, bright smile broke across Mina's face, and for a second, the coldness of the manor seemed to melt away. But then, the heavy door clicked open. A guard stood there, his face as hard as a brick wall. He didn't say a word, but his presence was a reminder that this wasn't a normal home. Zora felt his cold gaze on her, judging her striped uniform and her messy bun. She realized then that being inside the gates didn't mean she was safe. It just meant she was close enough for the old world to watch her every move. The sun was setting behind the tall trees of the estate, casting long, thin shadows that looked like fingers reaching across the lawn. Inside the manor, the air felt heavier than usual. Zora had spent the afternoon teaching Mina how to make paper airplanes. They had laughed as the planes looped and dived through the air, but the laughter died down when a group of men in dark suits marched down the hallway. Their shoes clicked against the marble like the ticking of a dangerous clock. "Stay here, Mina," Zora whispered, her heart giving a nervous little jump. She could feel that something was wrong. The air in the house had turned cold, the kind of cold that comes before a big storm. Mina didn't argue. She just sat on the rug and hugged her knees. Zora stepped out into the hall, intending to close the door, but she stopped when she heard a raised voice coming from the large study at the end of the corridor. It wasn't a shout. It was something worse, a low, freezing growl that made the hair on her arms stand up. She moved closer, her footsteps silent on the thick carpet. Through the crack in the heavy oak doors, she saw Ji-hoon. He wasn't the calm father who placed a hand on Mina's back anymore. He was standing behind his desk, his face as sharp as a blade. Two men were kneeling on the floor in front of him, their heads bowed so low they were almost touching the wood. They were shaking. "I gave you a simple task," Ji-hoon said. His voice was quiet, but it filled the room like smoke. "You thought you could take a shortcut. You thought I wouldn't notice a missing piece of my business. Please, Mr. Kong," one of the men begged. His voice was wet with fear. "We thought—" "That is your mistake," Ji-hoon interrupted. He stepped around the desk. His movements were smooth and slow, like a tiger deciding where to strike. "You are not paid to think. You are paid to follow the plan I built. In this city, my word is the law. If you break my law, you vanish." Zora watched as Ji-hoon leaned down. He didn't hit them. He didn't even touch them. He just whispered something into the first man's ear that made the man turn as pale as a ghost. With a small flick of his wrist, Ji-hoon signaled to the guards standing by the wall. They grabbed the two men by their arms and dragged them toward a back exit. Zora scrambled back, her breath coming in short, jagged gasps. She leaned against the wall, her hands trembling. She had seen the architect at work. This wasn't just a rich man in a big house. This was a man who held the lives of people in his hands and could crush them without blinking. He controlled the docks, the warehouses, and the very streets she used to drive on. She thought about the gold necklace in her pocket and the high salary he was paying her. For the first time, the money felt heavy. She realized that the small mercies she had seen at the gate were only a tiny part of who Ji-hoon Kong really was. He was a man of shadows, and she was standing right in the middle of them. The storm that had been brewing in the city finally broke over Mansion Manor, but the real trouble was inside. It started in the middle of the night when the golden silence of the house was shattered by a soft, rhythmic thumping. Zora, who had been sleeping in the staff wing, sat up instantly. Her heart was already racing before she even reached Mina's bedroom door. Inside, the lights were low. Mina was curled into a small ball under her silk blankets. Her face flushed a deep, painful red. Her breathing sounded like dry leaves scraping against the sidewalk. When Zora reached out to touch her forehead, she gasped. The little girl was burning with a fever so hot it felt like it could melt the very air around her. "Mina? Honey, talk to me," Zora whispered, her voice steady even though she was terrified. Mina's eyes fluttered open, but they were glassy and unfocused. She didn't reach for her father, and she didn't call for the doctor who lived on the estate. Instead, her small, trembling hand reached out and gripped Zora's sleeve. She held on with a strength that shouldn't have been possible for a sick child. "Don't go," Mina choked out, her voice barely a squeak. "Zora, stay." Within minutes, the room was full of shadows. Ji-hoon appeared in the doorway, his silk robe flowing behind him like a dark cape. His face, usually as hard as stone, was cracked with a look of pure panic. Behind him stood a doctor in a white coat, carrying a heavy black bag. "Move aside," the doctor said, reaching for Mina's hand. But as soon as the doctor touched her, Mina let out a sharp cry and pulled away, burying her face in Zora's shoulder. She wouldn't let go of Zora's uniform. She began to sob, a sound so lonely and scared that it made Zora's eyes fill with tears. The guards stood by the door, looking lost. For all their guns and their money, they couldn't make a little girl feel safe. Ji-hoon stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Zora. He saw the way Zora was humming a low, soft song, a song her own grandmother used to sing back in the city when the lights went out and the world felt too big. He watched Zora rock Mina back and forth, ignoring the doctor and the architect himself. "Let her stay," Ji-hoon commanded, his voice shaking just a little. "Doctor, do your work, but the girl stays where she is." For the next 4 hours, Zora didn't move. Her legs went numb and her back ached, but she held Mina through every cold cloth and every bitter medicine. She talked to her about the bright colors of the city and the way the sun looked when it hit the windows of the delivery vans. She told her stories about being brave when you feel small. By dawn, the fever finally broke. Mina fell into a deep, natural sleep, her hand still tucked into Zora's palm. Ji-hoon was still standing by the window, watching them. He didn't look like a boss who controlled the city anymore. He looked like a father who had just realized that some debts couldn't be paid with gold. The bond was no longer just about a job or a necklace. It was a promise. Zora looked up at Ji-hoon, and for the first time, he gave her a small, respectful nod. He knew now that Zora Vance was the only thing in this house that Mina truly owned. The peace inside Mansion Manor didn't last long. Outside the high stone walls, the city was whispering. People were talking about the delivery girl who had vanished into the Mafia boss's house. In the dark corners of the city, Ji-hoon's enemies were watching. They didn't see Zora as a person. They saw her as a crack in a perfect suit of armor. To them, she was away inside. It happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Zora was in the kitchen, packing a small snack for Mina, when one of the side doors opened. A man she had never seen before stepped inside. He wasn't wearing a suit like Ji-hoon's men. He wore a faded jacket and a cap pulled low over his eyes. He looked like the people Zora used to work with at Safe Wacko. "Zora? Zora Vance?" he whispered, his eyes darting around the room. Zora froze, her hand hovering over a plate of fruit. "Who are you? You aren't supposed to be in here." "The guards. The guards are busy at the front gate," the man interrupted. He stepped closer, reaching into his pocket. Zora flinched, but he didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a thick envelope stuffed with cash. "Listen to me, Zora. We know who you are. We know you're just a girl from the neighborhood trying to get by. You don't belong with these monsters." Zora's heart hammered against her ribs. "I have a job here. I'm taking care of a child. A child who lives on blood money," the man hissed. He pushed the envelope toward her. "Take this. It's more than you'd make in 5 years of deliveries. All we need is for you to leave the back basement door unlocked tonight, just for 10 minutes. Then you take the money and disappear. You can go back to your real life. You can be safe." Zora looked at the envelope. She thought about her peeling wallpaper, her broken car, and the way her stomach used to knot up when the electric bill arrived. This money was freedom. It was the plan B she never had. She looked at the man's face and saw a glimmer of hope. Maybe he was right. Maybe she was just a nobody caught in a war she didn't understand. But then, she heard a soft sound from the hallway. It was the pitter-patter of small feet. Mina appeared in the doorway, holding a paper airplane Zora had made for her. The little girl didn't see the man in the shadows. She only saw Zora. She smiled, a bright, trusting smile that reached all the way to her eyes. Zora looked back at the man with the money. If she unlocked that door, those feet wouldn't be running down the hall tomorrow. The golden cage would become a grave. "Get out," Zora said. Her voice was quiet, but it was as hard as the marble floors. "Don't be a fool," the man warned, his face turning mean. "You owe these people nothing." "I owe her everything," Zora replied, pointing toward Mina. Before the man could move, Zora reached for the heavy silver bell on the counter and rang it with all her might. The sound echoed through the manor like a thunderclap. The man cursed, dropped the money, and scrambled back out the door just as the clicking of guard boots began to fill the hallway. Zora stood her ground, her body shaking but her head held high. She had been tested by the world she came from, and she had chosen the world she was protecting. She wasn't just an outsider anymore. She was a shield. The rain had stopped, leaving the manor grounds smelling of wet stone and expensive pine. Inside the study, the fire in the hearth crackled, but it didn't make the room feel any warmer. Zora stood in front of Ji-hoon's desk, her fingers digging into the velvet fabric of her pockets. Slowly, she pulled out the gold necklace Mina had given her on that first day. She placed it on the dark wood of the desk. "I can't keep this anymore, Mr. Kong," Zora said. Her voice was small, but didn't shake. Ji-hoon didn't look at the gold. He kept his eyes on Zora. "Why? You earned it. You protected my daughter today. You turned away enough money to change your life." Zora looked at the paintings on the walls. Portraits of men who looked like Ji-hoon, all proud and powerful. "That's the problem. To you, this is just a piece of metal. To the people I know, this is a house. It's a car. It's a future. But it doesn't belong to me. Every time I look at it, I remember that I'm only here because a box of noodles fell in the mud." Ji-hoon leaned back in his leather chair. "You think I only see you as a delivery girl?" "I think the world only sees me as a delivery girl," Zora corrected him. "In the city, people like me are invisible until we make a mistake. Then we're just a problem to be moved out of the way. I'm a black woman from a neighborhood where the police don't even like to stop. You're a man who owns the city. We aren't in the same story, Mr. Kong. This gold, it feels like a lie I'm telling myself." Ji-hoon was silent for a long time. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gates where they had first met. "Do you know why I let me to give you that?" he asked softly. "In my world, everyone wants something from me. They want power or they want fear. But when you were crying in the rain, you weren't looking for a handout. You were mourning your hard work. You had a dignity that my money couldn't buy." He turned back to face her. "You think this gold defines who is in charge. But today, you showed me that power isn't about who has the most. It's about who can't be bought. My enemies thought you were weak because you are an outsider, because of where you come from and what you look like. They were wrong. You are the strongest person in this house." Zora looked at the necklace, then back at the man who everyone else was afraid of. For the first time, she didn't see a mafia boss or a billionaire. She saw a man who was just as trapped by his gold as she was by her poverty. "Keep it, Zora," Ji-hoon said, his voice firm. "Not as a payment for a ruined meal. Keep it as a reminder that you aren't invisible to us. You aren't just a girl who delivered a package. You are the woman who saved my heart." Zora reached out and touched the cool metal. She didn't put it in her pocket this time. She clutched it in her hand, feeling the weight of it. It still felt like a lot of money, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a weight. It felt like a bridge. The sun rose over Mansion Manor, but it didn't feel like the cold, distant light Zora had seen on her first day. This time, the morning was warm and golden. Zora stood in the grand entrance of the house, looking at her reflection in the tall mirrors. She wasn't wearing the blue and white Safewacko uniform anymore. Instead, she wore a simple, elegant dress that made her feel like she finally belonged in her own skin. In her hand, she held the gold necklace. She didn't hide it in her pocket or treat it like a secret. She draped it around her neck, letting the heavy metal rest against her heart. It was no longer a sign of a debt or a ruined delivery. It was a sign that she was seen. "Zora, look!" Mina's voice echoed down the hallway. The little girl came running, her long side braid bouncing behind her. She wasn't carrying a doll this time. She was carrying a backpack. For the first time in years, the Mansion Manor gates weren't just staying shut to keep people out. They were opening to let someone go out into the world. Ji-hoon had decided that Mina would start going to a real school, and Zora would be the one to take her. Ji-hoon stepped out from his study, his dark wool overcoat draped over his shoulders. He looked at Zora, and for the first time, his sharp features were soft with a genuine smile. He didn't look like a man who was building an empire of shadows. He looked like a man who was finally building a home. "The car is ready," Ji-hoon said, his voice calm and steady. "But today, the driver is not one of my men. You will take her, Zora. I trust your hands more than I trust any of theirs." He handed Zora a set of keys. They weren't for the old, coughing car she used to drive. They were for a safe, sturdy vehicle that would carry them wherever they needed to go. Zora took the keys, her fingers brushing against his. The silence of the house was gone, replaced by the sound of Mina's laughter and the chirping of birds in the garden. As they walked toward the gates, the old world guard stood at attention. But as Zora passed, they didn't look through her like she was made of glass. They bowed their heads in a sign of real respect. They knew that Zora wasn't just a guest or a servant. She was the foundation that was holding the family together. The massive iron gates creaked open, moving slowly to reveal the city beyond. Zora looked out at the streets where she used to be invisible. She remembered the rain, the spilled noodles, and the hot tears of a woman who thought she had no future. She wished she could go back and tell that girl that the last straw wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a life she never dared to dream of. Zora took Mina's hand and stepped through the gates. She wasn't running away from her past, and she wasn't hiding from the power of the Kong name. She was walking into the light, a strong black woman standing tall beside a new family. The delivery girl was gone, and in her place was a woman who knew exactly what she was worth. Together, they drove out into the city, ready to face a future that was no longer made of shadows, but of gold.